Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to the Daily Check-In for September 24th, 2020. My mind just completely went blank. That's fine. Today, what I want to talk about is sort of a tangent on the Raspberry Pi stuff I've been doing, which is on itself a tangent on the Edge stuff I've been doing. So we're on a tangent of a tangent, which maybe that's a cosine wave. I don't really know. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about my home lab, what I'm thinking about, what I'm planning to do, and maybe what you're looking to get out of Thursdays. Thursdays at the Edge, it's an interesting idea. I want to push it a step further, and I want to, go down that path with you, especially when it comes to what examples I can show you in building out that home lab a little bit more. So that is what I'm going to talk about today. Before I do that, I don't have any housekeeping things, except I just want to say, go out and register to vote. If you haven't registered to vote, please go do so. This election is going to be pretty important. And once you've registered to vote, hey, if you don't mind and you have the time and the ability, go volunteer at the polls. That is going to be super important this year. Normally, polls are staffed by a lot of elderly senior citizen type people, and a lot of them are not going to want to do it this year because of the pandemic. If you're a younger person and you have the time and the ability to do it, volunteer at the polls. I volunteered for the polls in my area. I don't know which one I'm going to be at, but I'm going to be at one, and that's going to be on election day because I feel like that's an important thing to do. So, please join me on that. You can go to Power to the Polls to register and figure out where you need to go to volunteer. I'll include a link down in the description. Okay, so enough with that. How are you? How's it going? Let's check in. What's shaking? What's crack-a-lacking on Thursdays? It's been an interesting day for me. My son, I took him to the dentist and he was supposed to get a crown, and they looked at his teeth and they said, well, that's a baby tooth and you've got another tooth coming in right underneath it. So we're just going to pull this out and the one next to it. So he had two teeth pulled today. So he is recuperating in the house, and I feel just awful for him. So he's going to get a bunch of ice cream, and the tooth fairy is sure enough going to be making a visit tonight. So that's what's going on with me. I hope you had a slightly more enjoyable day. Let's talk about my home lab. So the reason I want to talk about this is I've been doing these Raspberry Pi demos, right? Like I've got my Raspberry Pi here, but I don't just have one. I've got another one, and oh, look at that. I've got another one, and oh, look at that. I've got a whole stack of them. I've got a lot of Raspberry Pis is what I'm saying. And the reason I did that is because they're cheap. It's very inexpensive to buy 4 Raspberry Pis and the little acrylic thing to hold it all. And I already had a network switch, like an 8-port network switch that somebody was getting rid of. And the only thing I really had to buy was a USB power supply, and boom, I've got a cluster of Raspberry Pis. That was like the whole thing was maybe $300, which in the grand scheme of things is not a ton of money when you're building a home lab. Some people spend hundreds of thousands, not hundreds, but tens of thousands of dollars on their home lab. That's cool for Raspberry Pi stuff, but I started thinking about how I might want to expand that. And so I do have one rack-mounted server that I bought specifically to run the Azure Stack Hub development kit, because as an Azure Stack MVP, I felt like I needed to keep up on that after I quit my consulting job, because at the consulting place, I had access to one of these servers and I didn't have to pay for it. Well, I bought one and I loaded it up with RAM, and the whole thing still cost me under $2,000, which is not bad. If you go to ServerMonkey, they've got some really good deals on like previous gen hardware from Dell and HPE. So I have that, and I have it in this little half rack rollable unit. And I was like, well, I want to do something with that, but I also want to build out a lab that I can do more with and make it physical, because I could do nested virtualization inside that rack mounted server. And that's cool and all. But the thing is, there's a whole world, especially when you get to the edge of physical necessity. And that's something you definitely have to deal with when you're dealing with the edge. You don't have the luxury of these massive boxes that have ridiculous amounts of CPU and can run 100 virtual machines. You now are on more constrained resources. And so you have to understand how to provision hardware dynamically. You have to understand how to work with bare metal. And to that end, I reached out to my buddy, David Davis. I interviewed him for best career advice ever, and that was pretty recent. I'll throw a link up there for that, because that was a really good video where he talked about his best career advice ever. But I also asked him about his lab gear, and he pointed me to this Supermicro server. It's an E200 SYD, I believe, is the server full thing. And those are relatively inexpensive. They're still 800 bucks. I mean, they're not cheap, but you can get them. You can put a NVMe disk in and one SSD in there, and you can boot it off of USB. And if you do that, you have a really good potential virtualization host. You can also do Pixie Boot. And if you do Pixie Boot, you can boot off of the network. So I've decided to get a few of those, throw those in the rack, because you can get a rack mount kit for them, and try and get a new network switch for that rack that has PoE. Why do I want PoE? And the reason is for these guys, for the Raspberry Pis. Raspberry Pis, and I'm not sure what generation this started with, but at a certain generation, they started allowing PoE, power over Ethernet, if you have hats for them. Basically, what that means is rather than plugging them into a USB power supply, when I plug in the network cable, it also supplies the power to the Raspberry Pi through that network cable, which means I don't have to run a separate power supply for them. So my grand design for these beautiful little Raspberry Pis is to have them do Pixie Boot and use the USB stick that I have in the front one here. They're all going to have one of these USB sticks, and each one is going to use that as its main storage after it boots off of network. Now, if you know anything about Pixie Boot, you know that that requires some infrastructure. So I need to build out some VLANs. That's right. So the other thing about the switch is it supports layer 3 routing and layer 2 routing, and it supports VLANs. So I'm going to build out VLANs for Pixie Booting, and then I have to stand up a DHCP server and a Pixie Boot server to support these Raspberry Pis. So I'm definitely going to do that. The other thing that I'm really interested in, I used to be really deep into VMware. And if you're one of those people, you know that VMware has changed a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. The last time I managed a VMware environment was probably version 6-ish, around that time. And we're on vSphere 7 now. And I want to really get back into that a bit, because I understand that one of the big forces behind on-prem and edge is probably going to be some combination of VMware and also Kubernetes. So I want to get a vSphere 7 deployment locally that I can learn on. So I'm going to take those Supermicro servers, put ESXi on them, and stand up a vCenter and a domain controller and a DHCP server, and set up all of that on one host that will be my main host to manage the lab. And then all the other hosts are going to be just stuff I can have fun with. So that's sort of my vision for it in the short term. Longer term, if I have these machines and I have the ability to Pixie Boot them, I can try out a bunch of other cool stuff that's out there, especially when it comes to the edge. So the LF Edge org, which is part of the CNC, part of the Linux Foundation, it's their edge component of the Linux Foundation. They have a number of projects that are all about creating a hypervisor that can run on edge type gear, and some tooling and management stuff around that. Well, if I have all this gear and it's all Pixie bootable, I can push out a new image to these things whenever I want to try out a different version of software. So that'll be kind of nice. Also, Azure has their Azure Edge platform, which you can install on your own hardware. And they have the newly announced Azure HCI stuff, which I have enough hardware that I can install on. So that's exciting. So these are a bunch of the different kind of projects that I have kicking around in my head that I want to do with the lab. But before I do any of that, I actually have to get the whole thing wired up and configured. So my question to you, viewer, is what things are of most interest to you about setting up and configuring and running a home lab? Because I'm going to be going through this exercise and I'd love to do it with you. So if there's a particular topic or a thing that you're interested in when it comes to setting up and configuring this home lab, I want to know about it. Do you want to know how to set up Pixie Boot, deploying a domain controller, configuring VLANs, doing the routing against your home network and this lab network? How does all that work? If any of that is of interest to you, drop something in the comments or ping me on Twitter. It's Ned1313. Let me know the things that interest you about a home lab, and I will try to get to them as this Thursday at the Edge progresses. And I think it might be more just Thursdays in Ned's home lab might be the new topic. So those are my thoughts for today. Remember, tomorrow is Vault Friday, so I'm going to be talking about the next certification objective in Vault. I think we finished off on the CLI, so I'll have to look and see what the next objective is. That'll be tomorrow. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, everybody. Thanks for watching.